And share my screen, this one. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to have you guys all here. It's good to have a talk in English so we can see friends from other countries rather than in Portugal. And this is our 7th talk in the Portuguese school this year. We are having 12 talks. We started in April. We're going to have talks until the end of September. So you can join the talks in English if you only speak English, but if you speak Portuguese and English, you can also join the Portuguese talks. Today we're starting a session with John Hatcher from the US. He's going to have 3 different talks about Abdu'l-Bahá, and today is the part 1 of these 3 sessions. You have to register for all of them, so in that way we can manage the people who are here and how many people we're expecting, okay? So it's the same way you did to be here today. You just go to our website, bahaischoolportugal.eu, and hit the button on RSVP. And I have an invitation for you guys. If you speak Portuguese and English and is familiar with translating, maybe you can join us to translate one of these English talks to translate to English to Portuguese. That'll be great for the commission, the summer school commission. So if you want to do that, please reach out to us on scholars@bahai.pt. And our next talk, following this one, it's, as I told you guys, it's a part 2 of these sessions with John Hatcher. It's Abdu'l-Bahá as the center of the covenant, part 2 on July 25th. At the same time as today, 5 p.m. So I really hope to see you guys from 2 weeks from now. And if you haven't registered yet, you can go to Bahaischoolportugal.eu. There's information there on the following one, okay? So if you register, it's easier for us to contact you, send an email, send a reminder about this talk. So please do that. You also get the link to be here. Hey, oops, what did I click? And today, it's the Abdu'l-Bahá, the center of the covenant, part 1, with a friend from the US, John Hatcher. And this very small agenda for today, we're going to have a prayer with our friend Zé Luis, por favor, Zé, a presentation about 40 minutes, and John will be answering your questions for about 15 minutes. You can send your questions in the chat, or you can also ask live. You can just unmute yourself and ask the questions to John directly, okay? So nothing else from me. I'm going to start with this prayer. Zé, se pudermos então fazer a oração, eu agradecia. And then after the prayer, John will take over and start his presentation. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy this talk.
Ó meu Senhor e minha esperança, ajuda os teus amados a serem firmes no teu poderoso convênio, a permanecerem fiéis à tua causa manifesta e a cumprirem os mandamentos que lhes prescrevestes no teu livro de esplendores, para que se tornem estandartes de guia, lâmpadas da Assembleia no alto, mananciais da tua infinita sabedoria e estrelas que guiam à senda reta, reluzindo do céu superno. Tu, em verdade, és o invencível, o omnipotente, o todo-poderoso. Abdu'l-Bahá.
Well, welcome, friends. I appreciate your coming to this, the first in a series of 3 talks on Abdu'l-Bahā's function as architect of the world order of Baha'u'llah. Now, Abdu'l-Bahá has, of course, many titles, many of them ascribed to him by his father, Baha'u'llah. And many titles that we ascribe to him according to the functions and duties that he undertook as center of the covenant. Of course, the most important one was to be head of the faith. So I'm going to begin by going over some of those titles. They're not strategically necessary for what we're going to discuss, but they're enjoyable to hear because they inform us about why he is called the mystery of God, because he had such capacity in so many different areas. Of course, we know the prayers he revealed, the extensive writings and talks he gave on so many different subjects, and indeed the some answered questions stands in my mind as a virtual concise encyclopedia of most of Baha'i theological, ontological, and teleological questions. He's an amazing, amazing man. And of course, he is a man, and that's why the mystery of God. We expect this kind of output and breadth of capacity from a manifestation, but from a person who is an ordinary human being, at least in a strictly ontological sense, we are astounded by what Abdu'l-Bahá accomplished. And one of the things that the thing I am focusing on in these three sessions is what he did to actually implement or shape the blueprint for a world commonwealth that Baha'u'llah designed. Now we attribute the world order Baha'u'llah, and rightfully so, to Baha'u'llah. But without the, I don't want to say intervention, but without the innovations that Abdu'l-Bahá came up with and inserted in his will and testament, the world order Baha'u'llah would not have come to pass as it did. And you will appreciate, I hope, by the end of these three sessions, how precisely strategic his contribution was. So there are, first let me go and share my screen and show you some of the titles that I will proceed to read off. Let me begin by sharing my screen if I can. Hold on. And slideshow. And beginning. So, Abdu'l-Bahá as architect of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And we'll begin with some of the titles bestowed on him by his father, Baha'u'llah, because some of them are very endearing. And when I've given this talk before, it struck so many how we normally think of Baha'u'llah as somewhat aloof from the personal relationships that he had because he had to be. But he, in this series of titles that he bestowed upon his son, you get a sense of the intense love that existed between them. Of course, from birth, he was called Agha, the master. None of the other male children had this title. The mystery of God, and of course, I've mentioned that already, but a mystery because he had many of the capacities we normally attribute to a manifestation, but he was not a manifestation. The perfect exemplar. He is the flawless representation of what a Baha'i should be and how a Baha'i should comport themselves and what they should strive to become. The sacred and glorious being, this branch of holiness. And again, all of these are terms used by Baha'u'llah. The limb of the law of God, the gulf that hath branched out of this ocean, the one round whom all names revolve, the most mighty branch of God, his ancient and immutable mystery, And this is, of course, one of the dear ones. This was in a letter that he addressed to Abdu'l-Bahá when Abdu'l-Bahá had to leave Akka and go up to Beirut for a few days. And he talked about, Baha'u'llah did, about how much he missed his dear son and called him the apple of mine eye, which is very touching. A shield unto all who are in heaven and on earth, a shelter for all mankind, a stronghold for whosoever hath believed in God. Now, in addition to these titles are the duties and functions of Baha'u'llah. Now, this is a arrangement by the famous calligrapher and apostle of Baha'u'llah, Mishkil Kalam, or Kalam. And these are the titles arranged in a calligraphic form. Now, other titles that we use are more focused on his functions and duties rather than simply praising his spiritual attributes. Not that these are distinctly different from what we've seen already. The perfect exemplar, the instigator of teaching plans, his tablets of the divine plan, as we will see in the third session, began the whole concept and process of having universal or worldwide plans for teaching. The infallible interpreter of the holy text. Now we distinguish here between the infallibility of Baha'u'llah, which is what we call inherent infallibility, or the most great infallibility, and the infallibility conferred by Baha'u'llah on Abdu'l-Bahá. And the same thing with the infallibility conferred by Abdu'l-Bahá on Shoghi Effendi, as we'll see later in the talk today. But there is no distinction in infallibility. Something either is infallible or it's not. It's true or it's not. And so you don't distinguish in degrees of infallibility, but simply the source of it. He was successor and head of the faith. And of course, this is extremely important because, as you will know if you read the history, his half-brother tried to usurp that title from him and even changed some of the words in one of the versions of the Kitab-i-Ad, which was distributed to include him as head of the faith. He was the source of guidance for all questions that came to the world center after the death of Baha'u'llah. And so many of his letters and telegraphs that you find in Star of the West are answers to questions that poured in every day. And if you've received, and I don't know if it's been translated into Portuguese yet, but the new version or new translation of some of the tablets of Abdu'l-Bahá called The Light of the World, he talks about how he would love to write every one, but how overwhelmed he is with questions and with his duties. He is the source of guidance for spiritual assemblies. And this is something we're going to get into first of all. The spiritual assemblies and how Abdu'l-Bahá helped create this institution and refine this institution. He was the architect of the world order to the degree that I'm going to explain in these three sessions. So, this idea of his contribution to the world order of Baha'u'llah is not something I came up with myself. In this passage, in a letter written on behalf of the House of Justice, December the 8th, 1992, you find the following passage. In many ways, the will, of course, this is referring to the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, a very central document in the covenant. In many ways, the will of the master completes and supplements the Agdas. In it, Abdu'l-Bahá lays down in considerable detail the manner of election and function of the International House of Justice, what we now call the Universal House of Justice, its powers and jurisdiction. He also fills in a remarkable gap in that mighty book of laws, and one which any intelligent commentator on that document must immediately be struck by. And that gap we will discuss later, but it has to do with ultimately with the hukuk. So what are some of the institutions that Abdu'l-Bahá created in the world order of Baha'u'llah, or else he defined them or delineated them? And that is, maybe they existed or were alluded to in the works of Baha'u'llah. Of course, the communities already existed, but Abdu'l-Bahá shaped them, gave them regulations to abide by, gave them instructions about how consultation should proceed, how elections should proceed. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So here's how the classes are going to go. In this first class, we're going to have a discussion of spiritual assemblies and Abdu'l-Bahá's contribution to the creation of that important institution, and the guardianship. One of the things that was anticipated that I just mentioned in the Agdas, but was not fleshed out or specified by Baha'u'llah. In the second class, we're going to discuss his contribution in creating the national spiritual assemblies. These did not exist prior to the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. The Universal House of Justice. Now, of course, this was referred to by Baha'u'llah, and indeed, as we'll discuss in a minute, it was expected that upon the death of Abdu'l-Bahá, the Universal House of Justice would be elected. But because of the will and testament and specifications included in that document by Abdu'l-Bahá, this could not take place until other things occurred. Class 3, we will discuss the institution of the Hands of the Cause, which was created by Abdu'l-Bahá. Hands of the Cause were designated before Abdu'l-Bahá, but there was no institution of the Hands of the Cause. The teaching plans, as I've already mentioned, were instituted and begun by Abdu'l-Bahá. And finally, the concept of the twin institutions was made explicit by Abdu'l-Bahá, how they operate and how they form a complementarity in the supreme institution of the faith. So let us begin with this first one, class number 1, and we'll begin with the spiritual assembly. Now, the local assemblies existed, as I say, in communities throughout many countries when Abdu'l-Bahá was in authority. And if you have taken courses on the Rui courses in particular about consultation, about the elections, about the local assembly, about what their functions are, you'll notice that some of the most important advice about consultation and how to conduct a meeting, including the 19-day feast, are from the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. So before his parting, we have this institution that is shaped and refined by Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, first of all, the 19-day feast. many of the writings about how it should be conducted and the manner in which it should be held are from the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. And this is a quote from the Principles of Baha'i Administration, which says that the feast was inaugurated by the Bab and ratified by Baha'u'llah in the Aqdas. The 19-day feast has been described by the Guardian as the foundation of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And of course, Abdu'l-Bahá calls it the Lord's Supper, among other things. But as I say, his contribution is that since consultation is a vital part of the 3 parts of the 19-day feast and a more important function in the consultation of the spiritual assemblies, the unity and the functioning of the assembly is largely under the guidance written by Abdu'l-Bahá. And so he gives us guidance on consultation. He gives us guidance on the duties of the LSA, particularly on teaching, the obligation of the LSA to see that teaching takes place. Guidance on the election process, as we will see in the Will and Testament, particularly as regard to there being no electioneering and secret ballot and secret vote. Now we get to the second and the most important, well, not most important, they're all indispensable, but the institution that was the biggest surprise to the Baha'i community, and indeed to Shoghi Effendi himself upon reading the Will and Testament in January of 1922, when the document was opened and read. The creation of the guardianship, as I've already mentioned, was anticipated in the Aqdas, and we may ask where. I don't know where I see it anticipated. And the discussion about it is that because there was no one designated to receive the Huququllah, there is an implication that there must be some individual in charge of that institution. I won't get into that any further, but simply to say that it has to do with the Huququllah. So in the Will and Testament, it is created, and the concept of appointment of the guardian is spelled out, and the concept of the powers of the guardianship are spelled out, and the authority and the succession. So let's look at all 5 of these. First, I'm going to read you a passage that I find very important. This same thought that is expressed in this passage from The Priceless Pearl, a book written by Ruhiya Khanum about Shoghi Effendi, a remarkable work, is similar to a passage that from a talk that's available online by Leroy Ioas, the hand of the cause, who only months after the passing of Shoghi Effendi, made a talk in Johannesburg, South Africa, called In the Days of the Guardian. It is a remarkable talk. It's about 50 minutes long. I would advise you to listen to it over and over again. It's a priceless and intimate look at what the day in the life of the guardian was like, let alone the entire arduous ministry he undertook. Now, he also says this same thing. The essence of this passage is that the guardian had no idea that there would be a guardianship, let alone that he would be appointed to such a position. So you can imagine at 24 years old, how this must have felt as a devout and humble Baha'i to suddenly realize that not just the future of the administrative order, but in effect, the future of the entire world was on his shoulders, to be sure that the dispensation of Baha'u'llah continued as it should. This must have been just an unbearable burden, not some honor. I mean, of course, it was an honor, I'm sure, but I'm sure any sense of burden and responsibility and fear overwhelmed any sense of being singled out as an appropriate person for this lofty position. So let me read this passage from the Priceless Pearl. After the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, what Shoghi Effendi and the Baha'is expected, because remember, there were already communities, lots of them, and so they knew that the next institution, the final institution to make the institution complete, was the House of Justice. And so they thought, well, now that Abdu'l-Bahā's successor has deceased, we will elect the House of Justice. Shoghi Effendi assumed the same thing. Rahia Khanum says in the following, Shoghi Effendi had had no foreknowledge of the existence of the institution of the guardianship, least of all, that he was appointed as guardian. That the most he had expected was that perhaps, because he was the eldest grandson, Abdu'l-Bahá might have left instructions as to how the Universal House of Justice was to be elected, and he might have been designated the one to see these were carried out and act as convener of the gathering which would elect it. So totally unexpected, both the position and his appointment to that position. So you can imagine when they opened the will and Shoghi Effendi read the will and found his own name there appointed to this position, what he must have felt. So if you will, imagine yourself in this gathering in January of 1922, January the 3rd, and Shoghi Effendi reading, "Oh, my loving friends, after the passing away of this wronged one, it is incumbent upon the Agsan, the Afnan of the sacred lote tree, the hands of the cause of God, and the loved ones of the Abha beauty to turn unto Shoghi Effendi, the youthful branch, branched from the two hallowed and sacred lote trees, and the fruit grown from the union of the two offshoots of the tree of holiness. As he is the sign of God, the chosen branch, the guardian of the cause of God, he unto whom all the Aksan, the Afnan, the hands of the cause, and his loved ones must turn." So that's the first step in the creation of the guardian, the guardianship. But what exactly did this position entail? Well, everything that was essential to know about this position and the things we're going to discuss about it now, including the powers and authority of that position, how it could be, what subsidiary assistance this institution would have, and how it would continue, are all spelled out in the will and testament. And we're going to look at the various aspects of those different concerns regarding the guardianship. What was the authority of the guardian to be? Well, this is a quote from the will and testament. "For he is, after Abdu'l-Bahá, the guardian of the cause, the Afnan, the hands of the cause, and the beloved of the Lord must obey him and turn unto him. He that obeyeth him not hath not obeyed God. He that turneth away from him hath turned away from God, and he that denieth him hath denied the true one. So that's the authority. It's not spelled out in great detail, but he has complete authority over everyone else in the cause. And whoso obeyeth him not hath not obeyed God. That's pretty explicit. Secondly, he has the authority to be an infallible interpreter of the text. Now, where does he get that authority? He gets it from this document. In other words, of course, it all descends through Baha'u'llah, but it descends from Baha'u'llah to Abdu'l-Bahá to Shoghi Effendi. So the last, if you will, infallible interpreter of the text is the guardian. He is the expounder of the words of God, and after him will succeed the firstborn of his lineal descendants. Now that gets into another aspect of the guardianship. How is there a succession? Another position of authority that the guardian had. He was to be the president of the Universal House of Justice. He had no more authority than the other members would have, but he was to convene the body and conduct this as the chair of any body in the or any institution in the Baha'i faith has. The guardian of the cause of God is its sacred head and distinguished member for the life of that body. So what does the embodiment of the twin institutions mean? Let me explain. We're going to get to this, as you saw in my introduction in the third class, exactly what it means in some detail. But the two branches of the institution of the Baha'i faith are the learned in Baha and the rulers in Baha. The rulers are the elected executive bodies. And of course, there are three levels of that now. Now, at the time of Abdu'l-Bahá, there was only one, the local assembly. At the time of the institution, as we will see in the next class, he created a second level called the secondary houses of justice, or the national assemblies. We'll get into that a little bit in this class for a very important reason. So his position, though, until the institution of the rulers was completed, had to carry out the function of both of these twin branches of the institution of the Baha'i faith. And that is, he was both the interpreter of the word and he was the administrator of the faith. There were was no National Assembly at that time, and there was no Universal House of Justice. So he had to carry out both of these twin functions. And so let me read from the writings how it's stated. It is incumbent upon everyone to aid those day springs of authority and sources of command who are adorned with the ornament of equity and justice. Blessed are the rulers and the learned among the people of Baha. They are my trustees among my servants and the manifestations of my commandments amidst my people. Now that's from the Kitab-i-Ad by Baha'u'llah, the book of his covenant. So during his lifetime, the guardian is the director or executor of the cause. Shoghi Effendi was. Now, this wasn't intended to be the case in the future, and we'll explain that. But when the House of Justice was elected, he would be a member of it but he would not have any more authority than any other member. He is the source of learning, and that is, he is the infallible interpreter of what the text means, infallible understanding of the text. We get to the concept of the succession of the guardianship. And of course, this becomes strategically very important in the history of the faith, because without the specific guidelines in this will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, there might not have been a Baha'i faith as we know it today. The succession was to be the firstborn lineal descendant of the guardian. O ye beloved, and this is from the will and testament, O ye beloved of the Lord, it is incumbent upon the guardian of the cause of God to appoint in his own lifetime him that shall become his successor, that differences may not arise after his passing. He that is appointed must manifest in himself detachment from all worldly things, must be the essence of purity, must show in himself the fear of God, knowledge, wisdom, and learning. But there is a caveat, and that is, if the one chosen by the guardian or the firstborn, whether he was chosen or not, if the firstborn did not demonstrate these qualities, the guardian could choose another branch to succeed him. And this is the quote from the will and testament regarding that exigency. Thus, should the firstborn of the guardian of the cause not manifest in himself the truth of the words, the child is the secret essence of its sire. That is, should he not inherit the spiritual within him, the guardian of the cause of God, and his glorious lineage not be matched with goodly character, then must he, the guardian of the cause of God, choose another branch to succeed him. Now, this becomes very important, of course, because the guardian had no male lineal descendants. Thirdly, that's not enough. And that is, it's not sufficient that the guardian choose either his firstborn or another branch. There was another institution created by Abdu'l-Bahá, and we'll get to the important details of that institution next class. His choice must be approved by vote of the nine-membered body of the hands of the cause. Now, what is that nine-membered body? Well, the will and testament spells that out. And this is from the will and testament. The election of these nine must be carried either unanimously or by majority, from the company of the hands of the cause. And these, whether unanimously or by a majority vote, must give their assent to the choice of the one whom the guardian of the cause of God hath chosen as his successor. This assent must be given in such wise as the assenting and dissenting voices may not be distinguished. In other words, secret ballot. So we'll talk about this nine-membered body later in another class, because that nine-membered body becomes the custodians of the cause of God after the death of the guardian. Well, friends, there's much more we can get into, but for now, I think we have enough to start a good discussion, simply because we know what is about to occur in the history of the faith. So a lot of what we've just said will continue in the future classes, simply because the fact that the guardian had no children meant that there was and no branch, that is no lineal descendant of Baha'u'llah, who was not a covenant breaker. So what could happen? Well, we'll talk about that very exciting story, and it is exciting, and how it transpired in our next two classes. All right, so far you see that already Abdu'l-Bahá has totally shaken up the Baha'i world by creating the guardianship, which they did not expect, putting off the election of the House of Justice, which we'll discuss next time, by creating a three-tiered election process. And that is, you had the universal suffrage, that is, the Baha'is of the world would elect delegates. That's the first level. The delegates elect the national assemblies. That's the second level. The national assemblies elect the House of Justice. That's the third level. That didn't exist before. And so there couldn't be an election until you had electors. And if this new institution called national assemblies or secondary houses of justice were the electors, you had to create, excuse me, you had to create those national assemblies. And so that's the first thing, one of the first things the Guardian goes about doing, of course, spreading people all over the world to create the pillars of the supreme institution. Okay, thank you very much. Let me drink something. My voice is getting hoarse. And I'll let you feed me any questions, and I will answer them if I can.
I have a question.
I have an answer.
You said that the first institution were the local spiritual assemblies to be created. And I wonder how, on what was this institution based in terms of geographical, political divisions of a country, because we know that the world is, has different political systems of dividing their territory. So what model did Abdu'l-Bahá follow to, to establish the jurisdiction of a local assembly in the beginning?
It was kind of informal, frankly, and it was primarily in villages. So, I mean, you had the local assembly of Shiraz, of Tehran, and so on. And so it was mainly cities and villages and so on. And so the jurisdiction wasn't as critical insofar as complying with legal jurisdictions the way it is today. So today, when you get a certain number of Baha'is in a community, you want to incorporate. Well, you want your incorporation to comply with local legal jurisdictional boundaries. So, for example, here where I am, we have if you're in an incorporated city, then that's your jurisdictional boundary. If you're outside a city but you're in an incorporated county, then that becomes your legal jurisdiction. There were no such concerns in this early stage. It was simply they would meet, they would hold the 19-day feast, they would teach, and they would deal with affairs that arose in the community, which were many, and so far as people's different views of what the faith was about or what it should do and so on. And so Abdu'l-Bahá was constantly getting barrage of letters about problems emerging or arising in the assembly. And if you look at some of those letters in the Stars of the West, some of his telegrams sent back to the communities, you will see. I'll give you an example. When George Kerala, I forget how it's pronounced, who was a very important Baha'i in the United States, who brought in masses of believers, became a covenant breaker and started, he suggested that he be in charge of the faith in the West and Abdu'l-Bahá could be in charge of the faith in the East. And most of you probably know that story. But the fact is that Abdu'l-Bahá was bombarded by letters from faithful believers saying, what do we do now? This man is, and it wasn't just talking about Kerala, he was talking about others as well. And one of the succinct telegrams he sent back that I'll always remember is, he who dwells with lepers gets leprosy, or associates with lepers gets leprosy. And his way of, it was one of the ways he said, you stay away from the covenant breakers. You isolate them, you do not associate with them. They are poisonous and they will poison you. So this was the kind of thing he had to deal with, and that's just in the United States, in one area of the United States. This happened throughout the world, and he'd usually have select individuals with whom he had great trust. My friend Nasir Basralai, who's has Zoom meetings here in the United States, in Maryland. His grandfather is one of the people to whom Abdu'l-Bahá wrote a letter in this new book that has come out, Light of the World. And he was a member of the Shiraz. He helped start the Shiraz community. And Abdu'l-Bahá had trust in him, and they would write back and forth about the problems that were emerging and what advice that he should have to help resolve any, whether they were personal disputes or things like that.
Thank you.
Yes.
But may I ask one more question? What is the criteria for nowadays to establish the jurisdiction of a local assembly? Given that we have so many different countries, different political systems, is there a standard for establishing? For instance, I live on an island, and it's the political division of this island of Madeira is completely different from that of Brazil, where I come from, or from the United States. So, is there anything that's common for the establishment of this jurisdiction?
Well, again, the underlying logic is you would like your jurisdictional boundaries to comply with civil jurisdictional boundaries so there's no conflict, because after all, the LSA, when it becomes incorporated, has the authority and the obligation to perform marriages, to do funerals, to do all kinds of legal things that have to hold up according to the laws of the local community. And so it would have to be obviously the decision of the local of the community in consultation with the councilors and in consultation with the House of Justice or the National Assembly if there's a National Assembly. And this is something we'll get to in the last one, and that is the relationship, how it's evolved over time between the hands of the cause, which were the learned in the time of the creation of the institution originally, and then the counselors and auxiliary board members that are created to take their places once the hands of the cause no longer existed, because as we'll see next time, only the guardian could appoint hands of the cause, but they were an essential part of both teaching and protecting the cause.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I have a question. Okay. No, Gordon, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Pedro. I asked too many questions. You go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay, so I go ahead.
If we're too polite, nothing ever gets done.
Okay, my question is, I suppose the majority of the Baha'is, at least, were expecting that Abdu'l-Bahá was going to be the chosen by Baha'u'llah to be his successor. Was somehow why, I mean, Shoghi Effendi was not, I understood from what you said that Shoghi Effendi was not even a choice, or it was not in the minds of people, because for sure nobody expected that the successor would be any individual, right?
Very good. Absolutely true.
otherwise, but my question, this is a kind of, the question
This is precise what you've hit on. Just let me say one thing. What you've hit on is the precise reason there was so much turmoil and so much controversy and so much, what should I say, so much oppression of Shoghi Effendi by his own family. All right, because he had, after all, like Rui Afnan, who was his cousin, who's same age, more or less, and well, no, he was younger. But in other words, why him? Why him? And so, and why a 24-year-old? You have a 24-year-old young man replacing this celebrated, figure of such stature and such renown. So it was a test. It was a severe test, and the majority of the near ones failed. But precisely for what you're saying, they had to, it wasn't expected there would be a person. And there's again, no, I'm interrupting the rest of your question, but it's just what you're saying is so important because is it a sort of divine wisdom that there was no further, that we don't have any individuals now, nor will we have the rest of this dispensation? There are no individual figures of authority that will ever exist in this administrative order, other than the wisdom of Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi in the guidance they left behind. But go ahead with the rest of your question.
No, it's because, okay, because in one of your slides you mentioned the 5 qualities that regarding the successor, the eventual successor of Shoghi Effendi, and so it was stated: purity, must shown in himself the fear of God, knowledge, wisdom, and learning. Was okay. People were not expecting the individual to be nominated after Abdu'l-Bahá, but okay, Shoghi Effendi showed, it was clear to the people that Shoghi Effendi had these qualities, and or I mean, overall, it could be the successor of Abdu'l-Bahá from what he have done, what he have been in his life till then, or
yes, absolutely. Yeah. He was, first of all, he was the eldest grandson, which gave him stature just in a traditional sense. But also he had trained at American University in Beirut and also at Oxford and Cambridge for the specific purpose of assisting Abdu'l-Bahá. That was his life's yearning, was to be a secretary to Abdu'l-Bahá. But he was very widely known for his, I mean, his manner, his humility, his learning, and so on. But the fact that an infallible guide, namely Abdu'l-Bahá, chooses him, sort of puts to rest any questions about, is he worthy? But what you mean is, was it widely known that he had these qualities? That, you'd have to do all kinds of investigation to find out, and I don't know, but suffice to say that even his own mother and father ultimately did not accept his authority. So, in a sense, that wasn't his authority they were rejecting, but that of Abdu'l-Bahá to make such a decision. And so if just simple logic maintained their thinking, they would have not questioned that. But this is always the case in religious history, and it doesn't change in Baha'i history. The closer people are to the manifestation, the more dangerous it is for them to assume this is a person like me, this person gets sick, this person goes to the bathroom, this person eats, whatever. Why should I give such obeisance to such to a mere individual? And so you find the closest ones, such as Mirza Yahya, whom Baha'u'llah had raised, his half-brother, and Mirza Ali Muhammad, the half-brother of Abdu'l-Bahá, same thing. even, I mean, we were talking in a class, I give a class for about a year now. I've been giving a class which you're welcome to attend. It's on Wednesday, every other Wednesday night. And we just got through dealing with the rebellion of Mirza Khajan, the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah. Here he was not only close to Baha'u'llah, but he was the one who would take down the revealed word and fight it out. And yet when Baha'u'llah died, he rebelled against Abdu'l-Bahá. So I think it's dangerous to be so near in one sense, you know. But I remember just to go, I remember my own experience when I went on pilgrimage the first time in 1972. And I was not expecting this at all, but the one question I had in mind when I went on pilgrimage was, how could someone be a covenant breaker? I don't understand the thinking, because if you accept the covenant, you've already decided that you agree Baha'u'llah is who he claims to be, and therefore what he says and so on is authoritative. And so on the tour, and so this was just in the back of my mind, this question. I would like to know the answer to that. And I found the answer in a most unpredictable way. When we went into the room at Baji, where Baha'u'llah lived, there was his bed, and it was incredibly short. And I realized this was not only a physical human being, but a short person, you know. And that may not seem like anything, because all the women and everything were on their knees sobbing, and everybody was praying, and I had to walk out of the room because something stunned me, and I realized it's the physical aspect of the manifestation that is the challenge, or can be at any rate. So at any rate, let me stop babbling on.
Yeah, one of the insights I had recently in the Rui Book 10, you know, how families and people close to the manifestation could become covenant breakers, is thinking about families in the world, the famous families and all over the place. The will comes and it's read, and suddenly there's a dispute. Everybody was a family and in harmony before, but now out comes the knife.
And so, usually when the patriarch dies, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So Mike,
our matriarch, let me not be sexist here, because that's
right,
true.
Exactly, yeah. So my question is about infallibility. You've mentioned it several times, and again, this came up, of course, in the Rui book, and I think it's a question that people don't really understand. They think the House of Justice is infallible. Wow, but that just doesn't mean you can just decide to do something and do anything because it's infallible. And I think we could, I'd like you to make a little bit of clarification on that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very good question, and it's a much, a very worthy topic to make clear. Let me just start with this. When I was on pilgrimage the first time, Ian Simple, who was a member of the House of Justice, back then the House of Justice made it a point to reveal some new information, because the groups of pilgrims were small in number, and it was a very intimate kind of thing. And so the announcement for this group, that in effect we got the news first, was that the House of Justice had decided to build a seat of the House of Justice. And in an evening conversation, which the members of the House would divide up the believers, and one night one would speak and another would speak, and they invited us for dinner and so on. Very, very sweet. And Ian said, who would have thought the House of Justice would have made such a decision? And in effect, why is that a timely decision? Why is that an exigency right now? And it was clear to what he said, the great impact was, he was a member of the House of Justice, but it wasn't we. It was something that occurred when these 9 individuals got together under the circumstances provided in the will and testament, elected according to the means by which the election is established in the will and testament, and consulted prayerfully, but overseen by the, if you will, the will and guidance of Baha'u'llah. So I would have, my simplest answer I can give is that it is not, even though the election process is a refining process, and it is. So, I mean, you don't get to be a delegate, you know, presumably you elect the delegates with the same due consideration you'd give electing a member of the most important institution that you have. Is this person humble? Is this person, you know, and so on. So, I mean, this is why it's impossible to aspire to authority in the faith. The only way you can aspire to authority in the faith is, well, if I'm humble enough and do enough teaching and do enough service, maybe I'll be a delegate. And so you get to be a delegate and you go to the National Convention. Well, maybe if I say something really interesting in the consultation, people will vote for me and so on. And so you make some really good points and you get elected to the National Assembly. So now you serve for 5 years or until the next election of the House of Justice, and you get to go to Haifa and elect in the International Convention, elect the House of Justice. Maybe these hundreds of people all over the world have heard what a good member I am of this National Assembly. And then you get elected to a body where you're one of 9 people and there's no distinction of one voice from another. Your name will never be mentioned in any document. And I guarantee you, well, I don't guarantee you, but I suspect that everyone who is listening right now, if they were asked, could not name more than 3 or 4 members of the House of Justice. So how do you aspire to individual authority? You can't. It's impossible. So it's a sort of, I call sort of a self-cleaning oven, if you will, the process. But getting back to the central question, and it is a very important one. My answer is simply this, or my understanding is that the infallibility is something that occurs independent of who is thinking what or doing what, but simply because it is a divine process. And you can say, well, how can it be a divine process? They're just ordinary 9. Well, they're not ordinary 9. We just talk about that process by which they get elected. So they're probably pretty decent people to begin with. But it occurs independent of them. And you say, well, that's mystical. That's too mystical. Well, the whole faith is mystical. It is a religion. We believe in a metaphysical reality. And there's a lovely passage where in, I forget, it's the beginning of a chapter in God Passes By, where Shoghi Effendi quotes Abdu'l-Bahá as saying that Baha'u'llah, now being in effect relieved of the constraints of a physical temple, could oversee and in effect assist the faith in a way that he never could while he was constrained by a body. So it is sort of a fusion, if you will, of an incredibly ingenious system with a metaphysical input. So if you, and we'll get to this next time, but if you'll read what it says in the Will of Testament, it doesn't say some of the things they choose. It says everything they decide is correct. I forget the exact wording, but we'll look at it next time. But what you bring up is a very good question, and and you have to include this, if you will, spiritual or metaphysical ingredient, or you'll just come up with, well, the buck stops here. That's what it means. It means that's the final decision, and you don't argue with it. Sort of like other previous religions, aristocracies or organizations. No, that's not what it's talking about, in my opinion. So it doesn't mean the buck stops here, and it doesn't mean good information in, good decisions, bad information in, bad decisions. No.
Thank you very much, John. Our friend Christine also has a question.
Hello. So my question is, I have two questions. One question is completely nothing to do with our subject today, and another question a little bit, but not really so directed with your presentation, which I really liked a lot. So the first question that I have is that it has been so difficult the last years to be out of this social confusion that brings us down to and maybe to feel more apart from the spiritual. I don't know how to explain that well, but I feel that it's the perfect time to become more spiritual, to follow Abdu'l-Bahá's example and his perfect behavior. But it has been so difficult the last 2 years, maybe because of as well the social confusion that we are having and all the separation and lockdowns and so on. So one of the questions I have is that how can we, or how can I become spiritually more strong and to be more attached to the readings and prayers and so on, because it looks like this year has been in this situation, like a spiritual life, it has been quite difficult. And the second question is that it really came up in the morning when I was having a book 9, and we were speaking about the human mistakes and the mistakes that the human beings do, and the will of God. So the tests that are happening because of our mistakes, and the things that are happening because it's God's will. And then I remember that my husband told me that it was a William Hatcher, so your brother, who had told that there are 2 things that lead us to the insane that makes us sick, which is to know the suffering of the innocent, and when will end the free will and starts.
Let me state that. Yeah, what Bill was saying was, because we talk about this a lot, he's actually stealing that idea, not your husband, but my brother, stole it from Hand of the Cause Faisy, who was a brilliant man and an incredible speaker. And he says there are 2 things that we will never understand.
Exactly.
The suffering in this life, the suffering of the innocent, and where our will ends and God's will begins.
So it was from Mr. Faizi.
It's Hand of the Cause, Abu Hassan Faisy. Yes.
Okay. That was
All right.
The source that I wanted to know. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And insofar as what we can do individually, I think we all have to, first of all, since I became a Baha'i in 1959, we've been waiting for the calamity to come and change all the world, and all of a sudden everybody would become a Baha'i. We have during that time seen the envelope in so many areas pushed to their limits, such that you have strategic breakdowns in all kinds of things. And we need not number them or talk about, I mean, we're all experiencing them. And I agree that the atmosphere in the world today, whether on a global level or in your community level, feels depressive and oppressive and lifeless. These are the conditions that the Guardian describes in detail that are part of this cleansing process that will lead ultimately to the lesser peace, the breakdown of systems. And I could go on this discussion for a long time, but as I remember giving a talk in Los Angeles one time, and this individual said, well, what would cause people suddenly to stop what they're doing and pay attention to something more important than these distractions in the lab? I said, let the electricity go off in Los Angeles tomorrow and stay off and tell me how many days do you think it would be before you had utter chaos? Well, the irony is the next day a squirrel shorted out the grid and it wasn't off for long, but the electricity went off. I wasn't with the guy at the time, but I wish I had been. The fact is we're in a very fragile situation globally, insofar as our infrastructure is concerned, insofar as the needs are concerned. And you see, very interestingly, some of the greatest teaching going on in some of the remotest places. And notice the House of Justice is building the Mashriq al-Azkars, not in the great cities, but where the teaching is really rampant. So what can we do? And so we ask ourselves, well, I'm not in those places. I am where I am. What can I do where I am? I think each of us has special gifts, special talents. In one of the clues to those talents, in my opinion, is that you enjoy it. My wife is an incredible teacher, children's class teacher in particular, or youth. She just has a way of, she's very creative. And so she does it, and she does it well. You know, I do these talks because I've been a teacher since a long time. You know, and write about it and hope that does some good. On the one hand, I would, you know, I've found nothing more pleasurable than street teaching, than going out and direct teaching, something we can't do much anymore, nor do the neighborhoods in the United States with the current political atmosphere lend themselves to such things. So you have to be creative, I think, and decide what is it, what's special, what is my special talent, my gift? Well, you just translated this meeting today, that's one of them. Maybe that had a great effect. You know, I don't know. I don't have a simple answer to that. But yes, I agree that there is a certain, and I can't speak for the whole world, but I know in my neighborhood in this country, there's a kind of residual gloom, and it's not just from this pandemic. There is a schism politically and in every other sensibility among the peoples on this planet. And it's basically a division between a collaborative effort to make things right and a desperate effort to try to pinch yourself into a certain enclave where you can control everything and make things the way you want them. And these two things are not complementary. They don't work together.
Thank you. I'm very happy with your answer.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, John, for your answers. We have another question, and I have a feeling this must be our last question. After that, we will say our goodbyes and hope to see everybody for the next session. So, Tiago, John, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, John. Thank you so much for this introduction and talk. As you've mentioned, we're going through a change of epoch, a change of age for humanity. And when we look at the succession between Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi, oftentimes we look at the negative dynamics, government breakers, people who struggled with the ideas and so on. But could you talk a little bit about the positives, how it was received by the majority, how it was accepted and obeyed after the reading of the Will and Testament? Because I think it talks a little bit about also this change of age from the infancy towards the maturity of humanity, as exemplified by that small Baha'i community back then.
That's a very good observation. I like that very much. You know, I think I relate it very much to my own experience. I became a Baha'i in 1959. And of course, that was doing what was called the Baha'i interregnum, or the rule of the custodians. And that is, the Guardian died in 1957. This 10-year World Crusade was from 1953 to 63, where the House of Justice was elected. So from his death in 1957 until the election of the House of Justice in 1963, the custodians of the cause, and that was this group of hands of the cause who elected a 9-membered body from among themselves, were in charge of the cause. Now, I became a Baha'i in the very midst of that. And in the very midst of that, in 61, Mason Remy, a hand of the cause who was had been previously president of the International Council, declared that he was the second guardian. Well, I won't go into on what basis he did that, but it was kind of a specious backward logic that he used to claim it. He obviously wasn't a branch or a lineal descendant, so he was pretty out right away. But so, you know, back then there was a Baha'i news that was distributed throughout the world. It was in English, but so it wasn't just for the United States and so on. And it would include all the messages from the custodians. And I remember when later, I mean, back then we were focused on your local community, your feast and so on. And I kind of paid attention to what was going on the world level, but looking at the pictures of people from new assemblies around the world. And it was quite lovely. But it wasn't till a couple of years later that I knew enough history to know that, oh, that happened, eh? And so I went back to my Baha'i news to the time in the spring of the Rizwan of, I think it was 60 or 61, when that occurred, and when Ria Khanum came to the United States for the election of the National Spiritual Assembly, and lots of other delegates went other places to be sure everything was okay. And I read that, and I was astounded that I hadn't even noticed. I relate it to what you say in the sense that the faith ultimately occurs on the personal and local level. It's sort of like, yes, we're a global community, but we live locally, and it will always be so. And that's the wisdom to me in the House of Justice decision over 25 years ago, when they began planning the idea of focusing on the community level. You build from the ground up. You can't legislate spiritual communities. You've got to build them one at a time. So yes, I think what you're saying is very true, that the local communities accepted it, well, for the most part immediately. The only ones that, well, I mean, there weren't any communities that I recall that didn't. There were individuals that caused trouble, particularly like Mirza Muhammad Sohrab, who was Secretary of Abdu'l-Bahá. But his problem wasn't with Shoghi Effendi. His problem was he didn't believe there should be an administrative order. He thought it should be a nice religion, you know. So the same thing with Mason Remy, when he declared himself, there was only one National Assembly that had any problems, and you know, I mean, that, you know, supported him in any way. But that's a very good point. That yes, the heart of the community is at the local level, and that the local level is in touch with God through Baha'u'llah and the writings and the institutions. So I don't know what else to add. Maybe you do. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That's a very good point.
Dear John, thank you so much for covering this subject for us. This year is a very good year for us to have these sessions. Our next session will also be with Dr. John Hatcher. So there will be 3 sessions on this subject. We will hope to see you all for the next session, which will be in 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And it was wonderful seeing all these friends to join us today. And yeah, we hope to hear from you I'm guessing in about 4 or 5 days. This session of today will also be available on our website. So it's the Portuguese Baha'i School website, and you can watch this session again if you have if you need to. So our love, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you. Everybody can, if you guys want, you can turn on your mics and, you know, talk to each other if you want for 2-3 minutes. I will leave the session on, and yeah, we'll see you soon. Sorry, it's my baby. With his yogurt. I'm so sorry.
Oh, how old is he?
He's 2 years and a half.
Oh, wow, he's a big kid. Hi. Hello.
Yeah.
What's his name?
His name is Artin. It's an ancient
Artin?
Persian name. Yeah, Artin. Yeah.
We have a grandson that lives with us who's will be 2 next week.
Oh, great. Wow, that's so sweet. That's
Oh,
so
it's a
sweet.
joy. It's a joy.
Yeah, it's the light of the house. Not one dull moment.
Okay, my friend. Aloha.
Aloha.
Tchau.
Tchau, beijinhos a
Aloha, tchau.
todos.
Tchau, Sandra.
Nice
Ainda tenho
week
a chave,
ahead.
a chave da tua hospedaria, ainda tenho. I still
Ainda
have the
tens
key
a chave?
of your hostel.
Okay,
to the door of your hostel.
Não, então tens que voltar e devolver a chave e ficar uns dias lá outra vez.
Ok.
Sim, assim
Tchau.
que puderes. Estamos...
Beijo.
Beijinhos para todos. Até a próxima.
Até a
Adeus.
próxima.
Aloha, amigos. Adeus.